This is Courtney Gadd,
This is Matt King,
and you're listening to
the Bulldog Broadcast.
RES Edition.
Hey, this is Ms. Thompson, and today I'm here with some fifth graders, and they are going to share their opinion essays about tiny homes and whether they would like to live in them or not. Take it away, fifth grade.
I'm Ava Gilly, and I'm reading my opinion essay on tiny homes. Would you rather live in a tiny house or a regular house? You may have a different opinion, but I would choose to live in a tiny house. There are 3 important reasons I would live in a tiny home. The first reason I would live in a tiny home is because of family time. The second reason I would live in a tiny home is because of the cost and saving. The last important reason I would be okay with living in a tiny house is because it can teach kids life skills for their house when they get older. To start with, I would choose to live in a tiny home for more family time. The reason I would enjoy family time in a tiny home is because in paragraph 7, sentence 1, it says, families also love that in a tiny home they are spending more time together. That proves to me that smaller houses keeps families out of their rooms and in their living room together. Another reason for enjoying family time in a tiny house is you can clean quicker and have time in the rest of your day to hang out and work outside with your family. Also, there probably won't be TV, so if you have board games or any other type of game, you will be able to get along better with your family than any normal family in a regular size home. Most importantly, another reason why I would want to live in a tiny home is because of the cost and saving. A normal house would cost over $131,500 total. On the other hand, a tiny house would be about $30,000 total, which is less than when you would buy a normal house. I know this because in paragraph 4, sentence 1, it says, the goal is eventually to pay off debt and keep more of your money. This makes me think that in a normal-sized home, the people that live in them probably don't have the money they need for clothes and stuff like that. One last big reason I would like to live in a tiny home is because when I become an adult, I will most likely have children. And when those children get older, they will be able to do chores, which will teach them life skills. As stated in the article, but families with kids are making them work, proves that they will make the tiny home feel like a regular home with the same responsibilities. Also, it helps them understand that when they get their own house, they know how to keep it livable and clean for their children. Not only does it teach them that, but it also teaches them how to use stuff around them, like outside tools. In conclusion, I think that living in a tiny home is a great idea. I hope that after reading my essay, you will change your mind on whether you would like to live in a tiny house or not. I have stated my reasons on why I would like to live in a tiny home, and those reasons are family time, the cost and saving, and life skills for children. All in all, I hope that you love my essay and will write one on whether you would live in a regular house or a tiny house. Thank you for reading.
I'm Jeremiah Miller. Would you like to live in a tiny home? Well, in my opinion, I would not live in a tiny home. Even though I like the idea of living in the woods, it would be very hard to live in a tiny home. Here are 3 reasons why I would not live in a tiny home. You would have to give up some modern conveniences, having bad family time, and tiny homes are very pricey. To start, I would have to give up a lot of modern conveniences if I lived in a tiny home. For example, in paragraph 2, it says sacrifices must be made. You are going to have to give up some modern conveniences because there is not enough space. This means that you would have to give up some things like plumbing, a big fridge, and a washer and dryer. If you did not have these things, life would be hard and stressful since you would have to do all these extra things. Another reason is that if you lived in a tiny home, it would hurt family time. This is because you could not do things you once did before in a tiny home. Because you could not do things you did once before in a tiny home with your family, like board games. Also, you would have little to no room, which could lead to people getting mad with each other. For example, in passage 2, it says, "Everyone is so close together in a tiny home, moments alone are very few." You also may have to share a bed with people if you live in a tiny home. Lastly, tiny homes are very pricey. For instance, in passage 2, it says, "However, the fancy tiny homes you see on television are very pricey." For example, you would have to pay a lot of money to get plumbing. Also, you would have to buy furniture. And if you already had big furniture that you may be in debt for already, you would have to pay for smaller furniture as well. In conclusion, I have shared my opinion on why I would not live in a tiny home. I have talked about how if you lived in a tiny home, you would have to take a lot of risk, like getting rid of modern conveniences, good family time, and costs of a tiny home. These are my 3 reasons why I would not live in a tiny home. All in all, I would not live in a tiny home.
Hi, I'm Amaya, and this is my opinion on tiny homes. Would you like to live in a tiny house? In my opinion, I would not like to live in a tiny house. Today I will be talking about how tiny homes have small living spaces. Next, if you do choose to live in a tiny house, you'll have to give up some modern conveniences. Lastly, how you'll have to change your lifestyle if you move into a tiny house. I would not want to live in a tiny home because of its tiny living space. For example, a tiny home might not have a living room where you can bond with your family. In the passage, it says people living in tiny homes must get very creative, which states that you won't have much space. Another reason I would not want to live in a tiny home is because you won't have privacy. The author stated at night the dinner table may be put against the wall, and that same space is used for a bed. That proves if you live in a tiny home, you most likely could be sleeping in the same spot as your dinner table. Another reason I would not want to live in a tiny home is because you will have to give up some modern conveniences. In paragraph 2, it says, choosing between a bath and a shower is a choice you'll have to make as a tiny home owner. This proves that if you live in a tiny home, you'll have to give up everyday modern conveniences. Additionally, I would not want to live in a tiny home because you might not have a real toilet. In the story Bucket Toilet or Shower at the Gym, the author wrote, plumbing can be tricky in tiny homes, but a bucket toilet style is a great option. My last reason I would not want to live in a tiny house is that you will have to change your everyday life. For instance, you'll have to be in a small space, so if you're claustrophobic, a tiny house isn't for you. Another reason I would not want to live in a tiny house is because you won't have a real room. Most importantly, the author wrote the sleeping area is so close to the ceiling, standing up is not an option. In conclusion, I would not want to live in a tiny house because of its tiny living space. Next, I would not want to give up some modern conveniences. Lastly, is that you will have to change your lifestyle. Those are the reasons I would not want to live in a tiny house.
I'm Madeline, and I'm going to share my opinion on whether I would want to live in a tiny home or a real home. Can you imagine living in a tiny home? I can. I would like to live in a tiny home because of the cost of a tiny home. The next reason I would like to live in a tiny home is to spend time with my family. I will explain more about the reasons I would like to live in a tiny home. The first reason I would like to live in a tiny home is because of how much it costs. From what I have read about how much a tiny home is, the text states the average cost of a tiny home is $20,000. That is not much, at least as not as much as a real home. Another reason I would like to live in a tiny home is because I like to move around and enjoy nature. And if you live in a tiny home, you can move and enjoy nature. The text says one of these is that tiny home owners can live almost anywhere because they can easily move their tiny home to a new location. If you decide to build your tiny home, make sure to put wheels on it so your tiny home can move. The very last reason I would like to live in a tiny home is to spend time with my family. The text states families also love that in a tiny home they are spending time together. I have a sister and we fight a lot. It would be great if we could get along. If you have a big family, a tiny home will not be the best idea. In conclusion, what I have written is what I feel about living in a tiny home. I stated how much a tiny home costs and how you can spend time with your family. The last reason I stated is how you want to live your lifestyle in a tiny home.
Hey, I'm Isaac Amy. I'm going to be reading about tiny homes. Have you ever thought about living in a tiny home? Yes, I have, and I don't want to live in a tiny home because of the modern conveniences that I have. Could you imagine losing comfy spaces? I can't. Living in a tiny home is not something I want to do for my lifestyle. The first reason I would not like to live in a tiny home is the lack of modern conveniences. For example, I need normal stuff because I'm tall and I'm going to hit my head on everything. Also, I have to worry about plumbing because I am bad at plumbing. In the passage, it says you have to use a compost toilet, but I don't want to use a compost toilet. Another reason is technology. Technology is my second favorite thing to do. I wouldn't like to be able to work in a tiny home because I don't want to give up modern conveniences. Second reason is would not I like a tiny home is because of space and comfort. First, I am tall, so I would like a bigger bed. Next, there is no space for example, in the passage it states there is not enough space. There would be people on top of each other because it is a tiny home. All of my friends cannot fit even at a regular table. I think the lack of space is bad because I have a lots of family members. I believe my city lifestyle is important because I want to play sports and live in the city. Next, I don't like to live in a tiny home. I can't fit all of my stuff in a tiny space. I like to be organized and have a nice living space. Also, I want to have a big family. Like in the passage, it says, if you want a bigger family, tiny homes are not for you. My lifestyle is important with a big family. In conclusion, I believe a tiny home is not going to be good for me. All in all, the lack of modern conveniences, space and comfort, and lifestyle, tiny homes are small and annoying. That's why I would not like to live in a tiny home.
Okay, so my name's Hank Odell Stewart, and I'm going to be talking about how I think a tiny home is suitable for me. A tiny home could be better for you or not. In my opinion, I think a tiny house may be suitable for me, but probably because I'm short. In this text, I will be explaining why it's better for you from the cost and the debt and how you can be creative with it. A tiny house is pretty nice considering that it's pretty cheap. A tiny home, in my opinion, is pretty cheap, especially compared to modern house. A tiny house helps families if they're in debt. A supporting detail is that the text states cost range to build a house $150,000 to $425,000. Another supporting detail is average total household debt in America $131,000 and $500. A tiny house does not cause too much debt, but with having a tiny home, the debt is majorly less. If you do end up buying a tiny house, you can spend it on things like trips and steak. A supporting detail is something that the text states. Then they are free to spend money on paying off other debt or fun family activities. Another supporting detail is the average tiny house debt is from $30,000 to $80,000. With having a tiny house, you can be creative. You can be creative with a regular house, but with a tiny house, you can do a lot more stuff. One thing that you can do with a tiny house is put wheels on it and drive it around to a certain location. With a tiny house, you can do stuff like putting it underground. You can't do that with a normal house. With a tiny house, with a tiny home, you can have more land if bought land. Will have more room to put upon or a farm. In conclusion, I have stated my opinion about tiny houses. I have stated the cost of one, the very little debt that it causes, and how to be creative with it.
Hey, this is Milo McCrary. Would you rather live in a tiny house or a regular-sized house? I would rather live in a regular-sized house with lots of reasons, too. My first reason is that there is not enough room. My second reason is that you have no privacy at all. Then my third reason is that I do not want to have to use a bucket toilet. These are my 3 reasons. My first reason is that there is not enough room. When I am older, I want a pretty decent-sized family. If I have a tiny house, there will be no absolute room for my family. In the passage, it states, "A tiny house is much smaller than the average home in America," while this means very little space for toys. That supports my reasoning by saying that there is little space to put knickknacks and toys/games. This is my first reason why I would not like to live in a tiny house. My second reason is that you have no privacy. For example, in a tiny house, you can see almost every room right whenever you walk through the front door. What if you want some alone time because you had a bad day? Or what if you have work to do and the TV was loud downstairs or something? That is why I said there is no privacy. My last reason is that who wants to use a bucket toilet? You have to empty out the nasty waste outside and you have to deal with the smell. Not just that, but you also probably have to deal with flies and animals. If you just move into a house, all you have to do is flush. That is why I said that almost nobody wants to use a bucket toilet. In conclusion, I would rather live in a regular house and not a tiny house. To support my opinion, I stated that there is not enough room in a tiny house. My second reason is that you will have basically no privacy. Lastly, my third reason is that I don't want to have to use a bucket toilet. That is why I decided I'd rather live in a regular-sized house instead of a tiny house. Thanks for listening. Bulldogs out.